It is no secret that Pokemon has been struggling recently. A lot of fans have thought that Pokemon has lost the magic that it used to have. Some people will blame the lack of nostalgia, and others are going to blame the quality of the games. But ultimately, Pokemon has been having issues, and it's no secret to fans. When the Switch released, everyone knew it was only a matter of time until Pokemon started releasing new games for the Switch. Getting a huge jump in power made it so Pokemon was able to do things that they weren't able to do before. And fans all over the world got really excited about how Pokemon could use this new power to make the best games possible. And that has not happened yet. Pokemon has released a couple different games now on the Switch, and all of them have felt lacking in one way or another. The most recent of which being Scarlet and Violet, which released in a terrible state. There are three big issues that make fans think these games have been lacking, and the first of which is the graphics. On the DS and the 3DS, Pokemon was able to do things that made these games look good, but also stand out amongst other games on the console. Pokemon Black and White were some of the best looking games on the DS. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of how Pokemon looked on the 3DS, it still didn't look terrible. But now that Pokemon made its way to the Switch, it has to compete with other big IPs. Games like Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild came out in the earliest stages of the Switch's life cycle, and they look leaps and bounds better than all of the Pokemon games do. Scarlet and Violet and Sword and Shield both released and looked like they were made for the PlayStation 2. And Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl look like they took DS games and just tried to polish them as much as they possibly can. All of these games now have to compete with games like Pikmin 4, Luigi's Mansion, Breath of the Wild, Mario Odyssey, and it doesn't look good for them. Now, graphics aren't super important to a lot of people, but these games shouldn't look as bad as they do. It's no wonder why people were clowning on Scarlet and Violet when they came out, because these games looked terrible. The jump to the open world in Scarlet and Violet highlighted even further how bad these games looked. Breath of the Wild came out in 2017 for the Switch and the Wii U, and it looks better on both consoles than Scarlet and Violet do to this day. Pokemon has struggled since Black and White to find an art style that really works for it, and it's extremely noticeable now that they're on hardware where they can't hide their shortcomings. And graphics aren't their only shortcomings, the game's quality seems to have dipped as well. Now, I like Pokemon on the Switch, but you can tell that these games are suffering from a lack of care. Pokemon used to tell really engaging stories. If you look at Generation 4, Generation 5, and Generation 6, some of the best stories came out of these eras. But when Sun and Moon came out and they started lacking a little bit, I thought that they were going to readjust, and that never happened. All of these game stories feel like they're very one note, and a lot of the villain organizations don't hold a candle to what they used to. If you look at Team Galactic and Team Plasma, you feel like these guys are actual villains. But now the villain organizations are a bunch of students who didn't fit in, or a bunch of people who are fans of a trainer, and I don't understand it. It seems like Pokemon lost their ability to write a good story while keeping these games fun and engaging for kids. These are not mutually exclusive things. You can have a good story in a game and still cater to an audience of younger kids. Feels like they lost the ability to cater to new and returning fans. A lot of people will say that nostalgia is blinding, but go back after playing the Switch games and start playing the older games and realize how much better they were. And now it's hard to even do that. Trying to find a copy of an old Pokemon game is like pulling teeth. On the 3DS, you were able to buy Red and Blue through Crystal, and it was all included on the Virtual Console for $10 each, but they don't want to do that for some reason on the Switch. It seems like they're trying to hide the older games' existence from fans, like they don't want people to go out of their way to play these older games. And I don't know if that's a way for them to hide the fact that the quality of their new games is tanking, or if it's a way for them to not have to give integration to Pokemon Bank and Pokemon Home. I think it's a way for them to bottleneck the amount of people who can play the older titles, so when they decide that they're going to remake one of these games, there's not a way to play the older games on these consoles. But these games are always going to exist, whether it's on a physical copy or an emulator, and people are going to find a way to play them. And more people are looking to go back to these games because the quality of these new titles is just lacking. And Pokemon used to release a new game after a while, which made it so Pokemon fans could play an updated version of their favorite titles. But now they're just releasing DLC for their new titles. I'm not going to say that I hate the idea of Pokemon having DLC, but I also don't like it. Games like Emerald and Platinum were great because they offered the ability for Pokemon to change things and change the story. DLC just adds on new things to the story and doesn't change any of the problems that people had with the original game. Sword and Shield had some decent DLC, but I think that Scarlet and Violet's DLC was laughable at best. The Indigo Disc was a really good DLC in my opinion, but the Teal Mask was just like pulling teeth. I like when Pokemon would take their old games and make a new one out of it, like Pokemon Platinum and Pokemon Emerald, because it allowed for them to make the changes that were needed. Pokemon should have done something like Pokemon Spear for Sword and Shield, where they could have taken the things that people were critiquing, like the level of graphical quality and the Dexit issues, and got rid of them. It would have allowed for Pokemon to acknowledge the fact that they were struggling with graphics and then go from there, instead of just ignoring the fact that these games had problems to begin with. And instead of doing that, they just released Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Pokemon Legends Arceus. Legends Arceus had a high level of quality to it, but they didn't end up releasing any DLC for it, which made it so these games felt lacking. It's like they can't make up their mind between if these games should or should not have DLC. And then Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were lacking any level of quality because they wanted to be a faithful remake, but these games just ended up feeling so flat and one note that I would rather play the original games on the DS. It seems like Pokemon is making the wrong move in every single direction. And with the only Pokemon game in the pipeline right now being Legends ZA, I really hope that they decide to make these games more flushed out. And Pokemon is not done suffering because they have had controversy after controversy recently. Everybody remembers Dexit, and I don't understand how this is not being talked about still. You can't get every Pokemon in every game anymore. If there's a Pokemon that you like, there's a chance that you won't be able to use it in your favorite Pokemon games anymore. I understand that having 1,000 Pokemon is going to be really annoying for Pokemon to be able to include all of them while still having a level of quality in the game, but the whole slogan of this series is catch 'em all, and you can't catch 'em all. I like how Pokemon Home tries to make up for that by allowing you to store as many Pokemon as your little heart desires, but if I can't use those Pokemon, then what's the point of having them? Another controversy they've had that hasn't been talked about as much recently is that events have been so lacking that people don't care about them anymore. Instead of having events that bring you through a story, you just are given Pokemon in a special Pokeball. These events that they did used to have at least some level of story to them, but now they just feel like they're giving out Pokemon for the sake of giving out Pokemon. Think about the Victini event from Pokemon Black and White, for example. That was such a special event because it came included with every single copy of the game, but it didn't have to be done. They could have included Victini in the game for you to catch, but they decided to add this little event that made it feel more special. And they don't do that anymore with any of their events. Half of the Pokemon that we're given now are just Pokemon that were used in tournament by some pro, which don't feel special. Pokemon has been going through a big rough patch recently, and I don't know how they're going to dig themselves out of this hole. They're losing the ability to balance new fans and old fans, and I don't understand how they're struggling so bad. There's a lot of things Pokemon could do to make these games a lot more fun, like raise the level of quality of the graphics, create more memorable stories, include the ability to catch every single Pokemon, but it seems like every single time they try and add something new, they're taking one step forward and 7 steps back. I'm always going to support Pokemon because it's one of the series that I've played more than anything else in the world, and I play Pokemon pretty much every single day in some capacity. But most Pokemon fans can agree that Pokemon has been a lackluster experience on Switch, and I think that they need to figure out how they're going to make this series really pop, especially with the Generation 10 games coming around the corner. Pokemon is the #1 media franchise in the world, and they have never had an issue with struggling like they have recently. I just hope that Legends ZA does something that makes this game feel like it's a brand new Pokemon game again.